We will now have session 2, how do we protect the metaverse and digital space from online falsehood, defamation, and misinformation in the metaverse and digital space. The panel discussion will focus on legal reforms and developments in the metaverse and digital space and give us a reality check on the state of cybercrime, defamation, and misinformation, and talk about ways and means to maintain a fair, open, and honest metaverse and digital space. May we now invite the moderator of this session, Mr. Nick Chan, MHJP, Director of Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, AALCO, Hong Kong Regional Arbitration Center. Please join me to welcome the following speakers as well to join Mr. Chan for the discussion. Ms. Karen Yi Lin Che on virtual, President of the Malaysian Bar. Mr. Amr ELHENAWY, Consul-General, Consulate-General of Egypt in Hong Kong SAR and Macao SAR. Ms. Sandra Liu, Global Head of Privacy, London Stock Exchange Group, and Mr. Adrian Tan on virtual, President of the Law Society of Singapore. So, our moderator and speakers, please.
President, Ambassador, friends, hello. How do we protect the metaverse and digital space from online falsehood, defamation, and misinformation in the metaverse and the digital space? That different metaverse is different for different people, I think. The metaverse to me is a growing universe where if stakeholders work together, it will not only be a place where we wear special glasses or goggles to serve the space, to meet and interact, learn from each other, or build time. It's also a place for people of all different ages and interests to explore and work together and build a community. Statistics have shown that today the metaverse is worth about $800 billion and will soon move into the $3 trillion mark in the next decade. So how should we together realize these huge opportunities? As lawyers, as lawmakers, as civil servants, how can we make the world a better place? How do we protect the metaverse and the digital space from online falsehood, defamation, misinformation? We have a very distinguished panel with us today from countries that are very supportive for the Belt and Road. For that, I thank you. First up, I would like to invite Ambassador Amr ELHENAWY from Egypt to share his personal experience. Ambassador was raised and educated in Africa, Australia, Europe, and the USA. The ambassador is an expert in international affairs. Apart from being a good cook, I can attest to that. Also a very knowledgeable in protocols, security. He's known for cross-cultural communication skills across all sectors, across political, religious, cultural, and economic divides. He's also got additional experience working in the travel industry in the private sector. He has extensive contacts in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Ambassador has served in Colombia, Uruguay, Uganda, Portugal, and as Consul-General in Great Britain, North Ireland, Scotland. Prior to joining this post, he was ambassador to Slovakia. He speaks English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Arabic, and Metaverse. Please join me to welcome the ambassador. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, President Nick, my fellow panelists. I asked a friend about this session, and he asked me, why are you doing this session? Like, I'm government. I don't even know what Metaverse is, so I'm going somewhere there. Normally, we don't accept very easily that there are things in life that people of government do not know. But the metaverse is it social? Is it this new idea? So where do governments have to come into this world or virtual world? We're used to a very traditional world where we can feel it, trade it, and if we mention the Belt and Road, the initiative is a great initiative that was about to provide opportunity for people, exchange of goods and services. How can we do that in the metaverse? For us, social media, in my world, so there's two different worlds. There's the world that has the education and technology to sort of deliver content or create content. And there are a lot of other countries or other groups of people who receive the content. So I'm just talking from a more macro area. I'm not an expert in going into the details, which all the distinguished panelists can contribute to. We're in the business in government since, or most governments are elected by the people to serve the people. And in the process, they tell the people how they're better served. Right now, the metaverse is telling all of us, this is the future and no one has control. It makes it very difficult when governments mostly work on national security. So national security means that we have to be sure that those people or those agents or those states are not acting in a way that would harm our national security and our people. And we need to provide that for our people. So we need to understand that world, regulate it, and tell our people. And we have a lot of masses as well that are underprivileged or not as educated to keep up with the times. Becomes more difficult. So as I speak to you, in Egypt, they are having COP27. This is a UN practice. It's basically asking all the parties to convene again and talk about two protocols, or two, they're adding a few more, but the first one was Kyoto in 1997, and the second one was the Paris Declaration, and it's all related to the environment in 2014 that came into effect 2015. 27. 27. 28 is coming in Dubai, and 29, I think it's scheduled for I don't know how many more. So we have been meeting the world 27 times today, this year, to figure out a way that we can work together towards a better environment and a better world of how to protect our world from environmental changes. Some people were saying, oh, environment, how can you have 40,000 delegates fly? That's totally against the environment. Maybe we should do it virtually. That's not happening. Not yet, anyway. So what I'm getting at is it takes the human race a long time to find a way to, the UN system, sorry, I'll go off again. The UN system has its pros and cons. A lot of people think that the instruments that we inherited from Second World War are not working very well anymore. There's just meetings where people just talk about general stuff. But the rest of the world thinks it's a good opportunity to have dialogue and continue to progress. So the metaverse, to a lot of extent, has to go there. And people like me who represent government are completely ignorant to this, need to be part of this conversation and come to more events and understand this language and where it's going. So we can actually start having, as Nick said, like a whole sort of wholesome stakeholder engagement from all parties. I will very quickly go to a couple of points which are misinformation or defamation or things like that. And we see it from not a legal perspective where you have assets and you have to protect them or your privacy. We are actually trying to help not get bad information about countries, not get bad information to our people, and how do we protect against that? There have been a few incidents in the past few years where I think the new social media has now been accused of giving misinformation that affected policies in countries and the well-being of their citizens. I don't want to mention anything politically incorrect, but we all know about what happened in a few elections recently, so it's at that stage that we are talking, and at that stage that the state media or state governments do not want this to be something that would disturb national security. How do we go forward maybe with the Belt and Road? Maybe I can use this platform to ask Nick maybe, and why don't we do an event, a big event, where we invite the stakeholders to come and talk about how this is going to go in the Belt and Road. Myself, from my experience, from what I've seen traveling around the world, traveling to the less fortunate part of the world where people are less educated, they have less means, we're falling behind now with the technological revolution again. It's going to take time. In an international platform, it's going to take time. So if we start with the initiative of the Belt and Road, so that's one area that can then be expanded into bigger areas. I think the world that we live in is going to turn into cities that are influential in making the future, cities that can then have as a distinguished group of people who know how to resolve these disputes. They have the legislation. I think that the bigger picture for bigger countries is not going to be easy to be able to surrender how we talk about the content. What does it mean to our GDP? Where is this going? We like to tax everything. We don't want anyone to make money without paying taxes to us. So, you know, there's a lot of. I'm not going to waste your time on this. I think I was just trying to play the devil's advocate and show that there's a lot more that we need to talk about, a lot more to learn. But then Hong Kong can become a great bridge, I think, with its tools. And when I see the regulations, legislations that have been affected here, bigger governments, bigger countries will have a lot more difficulty to work out a framework quickly to accommodate this future need. I will stop here. I don't want to take too much of my time. I think the questions will maybe bring us to a few more points that we can discuss. But we are looking at a format that should address how the future world, or the metaverse, or your avatars, or the freedom of speech and interaction between people can be fair, just, and safe. Safe in terms of who is talking to who. We don't want to know that, but you have to find a way to provide safety and a good level playing platform for the whole world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We'll come back to the points you raised in our group chat. I would now like to turn to Sandra Liu, Global Head of Privacy of the London Stock Exchange Group. Sandra coordinates and provides strategic advice on privacy-related matters across the entire LSE group. She leads a group's data privacy team that spreads across many different regions. Sandra is a member of the International Association Privacy Professional Asia Advisory Board, contributing to its development. She's an experienced lawyer in data privacy and protection and the risk management with regulatory background, more recently in financial industry, data, technology, so on. Sandra has spent many years, but in his last role at the Privacy Commissioner's Office, she was the Senior Legal Counsel, where she led the team that contributed to the development of guidance, enforcement, litigation, compliance, and policy. Before that, she was a litigator. Sandra is a qualified solicitor in the Hong Kong SAR with a Masters of Laws degree and a proud member of our Law Society. Sandra, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick and Law Society, for the invitation. I'm honored to join the distinguished speaker of this panel. Much has been said in the previous panel from a data privacy perspective. So when I was here just now hearing the other panelists in the previous panel, I just try to adjust what I have to say. So I just play along and play by ears, and hopefully this, I would like to set the scene why I think that is actually more a data issue when I look at the panel question today. Because it's not just about defamation, it's not just about misinformation, it's a broader issue fundamentally about the data. In an online environment which is borderless, and in Metaverse, which I interpret beyond the universe, where we share and interact with virtual objects in real life and with real-time information. In this sort of environment where we can jump from one avatar to another, there are a lot of user activity, and often effected through avatars, has the potential of generating massive amount of data, so much of which is quite personal and quite targeted at the individual. So that's how data protection and privacy come into place. It's about quality of the data, it's about accuracy of the data, whether we can erase it, how to protect it, how to secure it, and at the end of the day, how to share it in different avatar, and also to ensure that it can transfer across the border in different jurisdictions. So a lot of it is about how we see the data policy behind it, and also the strategy behind the different aspect of these areas. So when we look at the broader question of the regulation, policy, etc., we ask the questions of the what, why, how, and who. So when I look at it, what do we want to regulate? Why do we want to regulate it? And then how to do it? And who to do it? I think a lot of these questions can be understood and better contributed by the community of the law society and also the legal profession here in Hong Kong. So, well, when I look at it, it's more about the governance, and also whether we need to put in additional guardrails with respect, and after considering what we already have. It is not the case that we don't have anything. We already have something, and whether we can better use of these something, and then try to put in additional guardrails and control. If you look at it from a data protection perspective, I think a lot of this has been said in the previous panel, and I don't want to repeat it. But there are a few legal issues which I perhaps would like to jump into it and elaborate a little bit further. First of all, is which law is applicable when it comes to this borderless world? And there are a lot of the question around conflict of law and applicability, extraterritoriality. When you look at in the avatar, whether it should be the EU law, whether it should be the GDPR, Hong Kong PTP, or even the PIPL, a lot of these laws have this extraterritoriality arm where at the end of the day, it depends on where the jurisdiction that the individual is based, first of all. Secondly, and the processing activity that governs underlying the activity. So when it comes to that, and it very much depends on the interpretation and circumstances. If you look at it from a avatar circumstances, it is really difficult to look at who is responsible and the actor behind that. Because it has much been said that no one controls the metaverse. And a lot of times when it comes to the online platform, is it actually just the online platform that we are talking about that we need to regulate or perhaps to govern? Because it's not just about that particular platform. Because if it talk about the actual activity, sometimes it depends on the activity that governs around the circumstances, and we can have joint controller. And in those circumstances, under the law, there would be different regulation and also obligation determining the controllers and also the processors' obligations. So in these circumstances, these data protection issues will be intensified in a metaverse circumstances. Take a deeper dive into the regulation. Say, for example, in the GDPR, in the EU context, we have a couple of circumstances which we may look into in an avatar circumstances. Say, for example, the purpose limitation principle, the data minimization principle, and what will those purposes be and what will be necessary, and how can actors in the metaverse comply with their obligations for privacy, and how transparent we want it to be. How can we ensure that the individual would be provided with sufficient information when jumping from one avatar to another? Are we going to ask them for consent every time when they jump between different avatars? So I think there are lots of these questions behind. And also at the same time, data access rights and also data portability between different avatars is another question. And whether we can ensure that the data of an individual can be erased in circumstances in different avatars is yet another question that we need to look into. In the EU, well, a lot of time we will look at what happens in different parts of the world. Most recently, we have this Digital Policy and Data Act in the EU. A lot of us look at what happened in the EU side. We have this Data Governance Act, Data Act, and also the Digital Service Act. The gist of it is to put the online service provider and also the intermediary certain obligations and to ask them to be responsible. And also at the same time, there would be some guardrails to protect the individual and also the children as well. When it comes to the Digital Service Act, most recently, it is described as the most controversial legislation recently being passed by the EU Parliament and Council that is seeks to protect the digital space against the spread of illegal content as well. So what we want in Hong Kong and also what we need in Hong Kong is something for us to think about. But we do have the Hong Kong regulation governing the data privacy part, that is the PDPO. The law has been updated twice, recently to introduce certain offences, but we haven't been taken too much of the in-depth deep dive into it. The Constitutional and Mainland Affairs Bureau has recently announced that they will also look into a comprehensive review of the law. And on that, I would say we have much to talk about, but I would say it wouldn't be just the security side, but also at the same time look at what we need from a data protection side of the participation that we need from the community, from the legal profession. Say, for example, the appointment of the data protection officer and also the accountability principle that that a lot of the organization help to build data protection within organization. So a lot of these we may have to unfold during the session that we are going to talk about later on. So I will hand over to Nick because I just aware that there are lots to be covered in the other sessions.
Thank you, Sandra. That's terrific. We'd like now to turn to Ms. Karen CHEAH, Lynn, President of the Malaysian Bar. She's the co-chairperson of the Bar Council Committee to reform the entire legal sector, a very important role. Malaysia has had many recent experience in protecting people's rights online. Let's hear from Karen. Over to you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for the kind introduction. So honored to be amongst all the distinguished panelists here. I'm going to try and share screen. I've prepared a set of presentation slides. Let's hope this... Right. I'm not sure if you can see the screen. Yeah, so, you know, my understanding of the metaverse is that, you know, this is a entirely new universe where we all have a different digital identity, or maybe even more than one digital identity in a digital space. And basically what we're doing is that we are living in two universes in parallel. And this, of course, is a very empowering tool, because then it enables both of us, all of us, to exist in the real world as well as in the digital world, and to do all kinds of commercial activities, to do even, you know, for social interaction. And the whole new two universe to us gives us so much of freedom to do a lot of things beyond what we ever imagined. And, you know, in Malaysia, it is the same. The metaverse has also taken hold in Malaysia. Some businesses have started selling NFTs, or the non-fungible tokens, to customers. And this have launched the virtual platforms to customers to play games, to order food, to, you know, earn points, order products. And these are actually, you know, usable in our real life situation. So, for example, Tiger being one of the brand names for beer, launched its first street food virtual festival in December of 2021, where users can pick up an avatar and access a virtual platform in order to order local food from vendors. And many international companies such as McDonald's, JP Morgan and Disney have a presence in the metaverse, all of them selling non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, and offering virtual experiences such as concerts or games in order to entice and engage with consumers. And, you know, in Malaysia again, in January 2022, a local fashion brand called Petzl and Mortar Clothing collaborated again with Tiger to launch the Lucky Tigers NFT collection, selling approximately 6,688 NFTs, which amounted to 3 million ringgit Malaysia in revenue. So, you know, it's a big bandwagon in Malaysia. And then moving on to digital currencies and digital tokens in Malaysia, the currency in Metaverse is known, of course, as the digital currency. And in Malaysia, the two regulating bodies are the Malaysian Securities Commission and also our Central Bank of Malaysia. And, you know, apart from the traditional pieces of legislation covering the currency in the real world, Malaysia now has in place the Capital Markets and Services Prescription of Securities, Digital Currency and Digital Token Order of 2019, which is a subsidiary legislation under our Central Bank Act. And under this particular order, digital currency or digital token are securities for purposes of security laws in Malaysia, provided the digital currency fulfills the requirement and the criteria set down in the order. So, you know, the digital currency in Malaysia, it is not a legal tender in the real world in Malaysia, not recognized as something which you can use in order to enter into transactions. Because, you know, in Malaysia, we just use the local currency of Ringgit Malaysia. That is considered as the legal tender. So, you know, having gone through the whole idea of what Metaverse is and what can be done in a completely different universe, obviously, the new possibilities will also expose us to new risks, challenges, and of course, a lot of abuse. The three areas, privacy and data protection, but, you know, I won't touch too much about it because Sandra had already spoken at length about this. And then there is the fake news or misinformation, and also the spread of hate speech. That is something which is very prevalent in the metaverse at the moment. And obviously, another area which I am quite passionate about would also be sexual harassment on metaverse, and governing the entire metaverse and digital space with all these risks and challenges on these issues would require some sort of regulation, in my view. There is so much scope of illegal and malicious behavior that can take place in the metaverse, and this means that while there are rewards about, a completely new world, freedom of speech, the ability to be able to say as much as you want, it comes with drawbacks, and also, of course, all these challenges that we have to face. In the issue of privacy and data protection, we know that Metaverse has created a whole new world of cybercrimes. It's a very immersive environment where it allows existing crimes to take place at a larger scale in the metaverse. The issue of privacy and data protection, of course, will also mean that there's a huge collection of data for our identities, and the collection of that data could include things like biometric data, maybe even eye movements, body language, which will leave a data trail, and this potential invasion of user privacy can be harvested and abused, especially when it is used without the consent of the identity of the person. On misinformation and spread of hate speech, I think we are all fully aware what happens in the metaverse insofar as misinformation and spread of hate speech is concerned. We are also aware of what is known as a deep fake, where there is the form of reenacting an individual's face and synthesizes their speech to potentially manipulate users into believing all the information that they see, even though they are not accurate. And we've seen, I think, in some videos where Obama was apparently giving a speech, but it was proven to be a deep fake. So in this kind of situation, the metaverse is a fertile ground for disinformation and fake news, and we can expect to see that problems that currently exist on social media, like harassment or hate speech or even defamatory content, to take root in the metaverse. If we think about some of the authorities that have spoken on this, and Bloomberg being one of it, the creators of tech startups such as Sensorium Corp envisioned a world of social interaction for its avatars when something actually unexpected happened during one of its demo of their tech startup. And one of its bots named David, who, when asked what he thought about vaccines, began spewing health misinformation, and he claimed that vaccines are sometimes more dangerous than the diseases that they try to prevent. So this is an example and demonstrates how easy it might be for people to encounter untrue content in the metaverse, and consequently how difficult it is to manage and control misinformation over social platforms or digital platforms. And I'm moving on to sexual harassment issue, the area of sexual harassment. So the metaverse is what we have, what we call consists of haptic technologies. It makes harassment very traumatizing to people who are on digital platforms because it feels like real experiences. And I'm going to just try and explain in one of the cases that I've done, where one of the victim was exposed to sexual harassment over a social media platform, and from there that became a lot of trolling. Then there was what we call the cancel culture creeping in, people who are trying to cancel the person from existing in the digital space. And because it is such a real experience to the victim, what it does is that the victim then withdraws not only in the metaverse, but also withdrawing in the real world. And, it is only because the experience that they go through is a very, very real experience. And this is only from sexual harassment that has prevailed over online. So, I think that these are some of the areas which we definitely need to look into in order for some kind of management or regulation. So how do we regulate Metaverse? With the advent of social media platforms, we have seen how those platforms have exploited the users as well as consumers, sometimes creating a toxic environment that spreads misinformation and hate. And those platforms also deploy the media as a polarizing force, which creates misconceptions in certain groups. And the problem with this is that it can get significantly worse if nothing is done in order to regulate this. And what I think should be the way forward, perhaps we look at several different jurisdictions. Sandra spoke about the EU perspective. In EU, they are presently trying to address the metaverse and all its activities and interactions by trying to come up with something in 2023. And this initiative is explained by the President of EU as to ensure that Europe is fit for the digital age. And the idea of coming up with what they want to adapt as a Digital Service Act or a Digital Markets Act is to seek to influence the development of Metaverse, and so that it creates a safer digital space where the rights of users are protected, but it also establishes a level playing field for all businesses. So that's what's happening in EU at the moment. And then moving on to closer home ground, I'll be touching on Japan. Japan too is also looking at creation of new legislation in order to regulate and manage legal issues involving abuse in the metaverse. And they've created a Web 3.0 policy platform in order to look into such legislation. In South Korea, the National Data Policy Committee is also looking into developing regulatory amendments to existing laws and even to come up with new laws to regulate the metaverse abuse. So, I'm just going to try and conclude this. We've touched on the possible benefits of metaverse. We've also touched on the possible risk and abuse in the metaverse or cybercrimes that's available in different areas. I find that insofar as the real world is concerned, I think the real world is actually trying to play catch up with the technology that's, moving at a rapid rate. I see this in the e-hailing vehicle Grab in Malaysia, where the technology went ahead first before any regulatory regime came into play. I also see this in the TMT industry for the implementation of 5G in Malaysia. Under the access regime, where the technology went ahead first before the regulatory regime is able to actually catch up, and we're still trying to play catch up. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We are trying to play catch up in trying to come up with a regulation for the metaverse possible cybercrimes. I'm just going to conclude by saying, should we regulate? My question is yes, we should regulate, but the question is how do we do this? My approach is that it has to be a compromise between self-regulation as well as, of course, governmental initiatives. Self-regulation would mean us, the users, or even the tech companies that come up with those technology must be able to do so responsibly. We must be self-disciplined. We must come up with safeguards in order to protect not just us, but others who are using it from abuse. I think that stakeholders, such as like tech startups or even initiatives in respective jurisdictions like sandbox initiatives, they too have a role to play in order to ensure that those people who actually do a startup must be responsible enough, okay, to come up with their own personal safeguards or boundaries to guard against those abuse. And finally, of course, the governments need to be a lot more proactive in terms of coming up with regulations at a faster speed, because, you know, we don't want to have to keep playing catch up where technology is concerned. So I'm going to leave us at that point, and I'm happy to take questions at the Q&A session later. Thank you.
I would like to now introduce the next panelist, Mr. Adrian Tan. Adrian is the president of the Law Society of Singapore. He has a degree in computer science and psychology, and he used to work for a government law tech company that assists with resolving problems, dealing with network issues, and I think also healthcare issues. So Singapore has recently passed laws called POFMA and FICE, if I pronounce it right, FICE, and also there's been a new development yesterday, Wednesday, so about online safety. Over to you, Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is good morning from Singapore. My name is Adrian Tan. I'm the president of the Law Society of Singapore. I'm also the head of technology and the intellectual property department of my law firm, TSMP Law Corporation. I'm sorry I can't join you physically in Hong Kong today. My travel plans are disrupted for health reasons. But we in Singapore are always interested to learn about legal developments in Hong Kong, because in so many ways, Singapore and Hong Kong are so similar. We're roughly the same in size and population. Our cities are roughly the same size too, and roughly the same type of history. We were both subject to colonization from the British. This leads to a similarity in legal systems. So today I'm going to tell you about 3 laws that Singapore has passed. And I think that by looking at these 3 laws, we can see how countries who are not in the West, like Singapore, like Hong Kong, and also countries affected by the Belt and Road Initiative, will be able to handle foreign influence, false information, and so on. With that, I'm going to start sharing screen to show you my slides. Now, the theme of my talk is very simple. How does Singapore protect citizens from online falsehood and misinformation? So it's about one country's experiment, my small country, Singapore, protecting the people who live here from 2 types of threats: online falsehood and misinformation. So to do that, we have 3 kinds of laws. Now, the first I want to talk about is the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. This is, in Singapore, it is called POFMA. Now, this law was passed in 2019. So at the time, in 2019, the big news was not COVID. The big news in 2019 was about 2 things. Brexit in the United Kingdom. This is where people in the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. And on the election of United States President Donald Trump. What was common in these 2 incidents was that many people were taken by surprise at the outcome and by the use of fake news on social media. So that happened just before 2019. And the Singapore government looked very closely at the situation. They thought that it was important to prevent the electronic communication of false or misleading information. As always, the Singapore government consulted the public and industry leaders before enacting the laws. Now, social media companies such as Facebook were invited to come to Singapore to talk about these proposed laws. And as you can imagine, from the West, there were many strong views that any way of controlling social media companies would infringe Western values of free speech. I think we all subscribe to this important value. But the Singapore government also had a value of protecting the citizens from receiving false information. So the Singapore government observed that Facebook and other social media sites during Brexit and during the election of President Donald Trump had unwittingly been used to spread fake news. It resulted in social divisions, misunderstanding, and conflict. So the Singapore government passed a law called POFMA, and it's basically to protect Singaporeans from fake news and manipulation. Basically, POFMA does punish people who make a false statement, not any kind of false statement. For example, we can say many false things on the internet, and that won't affect POFMA. POFMA is only concerned with 6 types of false statements. The first is a false statement which harms national security. A false statement which harms national security. The second is any false statement that is prejudicial to public health, public safety, public tranquility, or public finances. These are the things that Singapore as a nation is concerned with. Confidence in public health, public safety, public tranquility and peace, and public finances. POFMA also affects anyone who makes a false statement which is likely to harm the friendly relations of Singapore with other countries. So anyone who makes a false statement which harms the diplomatic relationships of Singapore with other countries can expect to be hit by this law called POFMA. Fourthly, POFMA also affects any false statement which is meant to influence the outcome of any kind of public elections. In Singapore, we have presidential elections, general elections, and by-elections, and referendums. If anyone makes a false statement that is meant to influence the outcome of a national election, POFMA will act to stop it. Fifth, POFMA acts against anyone who makes a false statement which is likely to incite feelings of enmity, hatred, or ill will between different groups of people. So in Singapore, we are a multicultural society. We have Chinese, we have Indians, we have Malays. Sorry, can you mute that? Sorry. Yes, thank you. Incite feelings of enmity or ill will between different groups of people. Now, in Singapore, we've had a history of racial conflict, and that was in the 1960s, many years ago. There is also tension between different groups of people from different religions sometimes. It's very rare, but when it happens, it can be very dangerous. So anyone who makes a false statement, which is likely to incite feelings of enmity, hatred, or ill will between different groups of people, will be caught by POFMA. Finally, anyone who makes a false statement which diminishes public confidence in the government. So it's all about false statements only in these 6 categories. Now, who gets to decide what is a false statement? Is it a question of opinion? Well, it starts with a government minister saying something is false. So the government minister must start by writing an official declaration that a statement that is published on the internet is false. But the party that decides whether a statement is false or not is our court. The Singapore High Court has the power to say whether the statement is false or not. So the court may disagree with the minister. And if the court disagrees with the minister, we'll see what happens in the case that I'm going to tell you about. So it starts with the minister writing a notice to a party that communicated a false statement. And that notice says, look, you have said something false. Now you have to correct it. And this is the correction that I want to give you, and you must put it on your website, or you must publish it in the newspaper. So that's the start. Then the party that receives this notice has the power to challenge the minister in court. And if the statement is not false, it is true, then the party need not comply with the minister's order. So one example, let me tell you about what happened in January 2020. If you remember January 2020, this was just around the time that COVID was beginning to spread around the world. And there was a lot of anxiety and concern at that time about this new virus. So at that time, January 2020, there was a popular website in Singapore which falsely reported that a man died after developing severe pneumonia, which is a way of saying that he died from COVID. At that time, we didn't have such a name as COVID-19, but it was implied that he died from this scary new virus. So the next morning, the Singapore Health Minister issued this POFMA directive to tell that website to correct that false information. The Ministry of Law said that POFMA was needed during the early days of COVID to tackle falsehoods. They said, look, without intervention by the government, these falsehoods could have spread unchecked, causing public panic and reducing public confidence in Singapore's efforts to combat COVID-19. So the use of POFMA clarifies the facts quickly and requires corrections to be placed alongside the post at their source. For example, on platforms such as Facebook. So you can see that POFMA is very fast. The day before, the news came out and it was false. The day after, the government stepped in and said, no, your statement is false, you must publish this correction notice. And why is speed important? It's because in the age of social media, people just read things and share them very quickly. And if you don't act fast, the news could spread all around the world. Singapore has COVID, people are dying. It's very important to use legislation to stop the spread of fake news, and the legislation must allow for quick action. Now, let me tell you about the second law. Remember, we have 3 laws to talk about. The second one is very interesting. Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act. Now, we call it in Singapore, FICA. So, what is FICA about? FICA is about foreign influence. So, FICA provides measures to prevent, detect, and disrupt foreign interference in domestic politics conducted through something called hostile information campaigns, or HICs, and the use of local proxies. That means Singaporeans who become the mouthpiece of a foreigner. So this is the aim. FICA is supposed to detect and disrupt any foreign interference, whether coming from a foreign source or a Singaporean mouthpiece. So what does FICA do? Well, FICA means that the government has the power to issue directions to various entities such as social media services, relevant electronic services, internet access, anybody who runs a website and blog, social media, to help the government investigate and counter hostile communications activity that is of foreign origin. So if you have your own blog, or if you're commenting on social media, or you have a channel, FICA can talk to you. FICA allows the government to ask you about the post that you have just shared, where did it come from, what is the source, to investigate, to find out whether it comes from the foreigners. FICA also includes offences relating to secret foreign interference, basically spying. So FICA doesn't apply to Singaporeans. It's a special law about foreigners. FICA allows Singaporeans to express their own views and to act on their own conscience. It doesn't apply to foreigners who are just reporting or commenting on Singapore politics in an open, transparent, and attributable way. So even if their comments criticize Singapore or criticize Singapore government, it's okay. It's okay. As long as the reports are attributable. That means someone puts a name on it. Even if a foreigner writes something that criticizes Singapore government, or the country, that's okay. Just state your name. FICA is against people who secretly write things and they don't say their name. Let me just move on to the next slide. There's a lot of things that FICA can do. I'm not going to go through this right now. I've included this in the slide. I understand the organizers will distribute this version of the slide, just the latest version. And basically, the government has many, many powers. It can stop communication, and it can make you have a message, and so on. So FICA came into effect not long ago, 7th of July this year. But there is another part which hasn't come into effect yet. So there are no cases that I can tell you about. But it's a law that was widely reported by the foreign media because they assume that they are being targeted by this new law. They're not. Only foreigners who do not disclose their real identities. Because if foreigners use Singaporeans and local people to mouth their opinions, then other Singaporeans who read these opinions may not know that this is a foreigner's opinion. They may think it is a Singaporean's opinion. And when somebody reads an opinion from your countryman, a person who lives in the same country as you, then you tend to have a different feeling. You're more interested to hear. If you read something from a foreigner, then immediately you'll say, oh, okay, this is a foreigner. I will still try to respect their opinion and understand it. But I also know that he does not live here and he may not appreciate my conditions. So it makes a big difference if the writer is truthful about who he is or is not truthful. So FICA is about being truthful. Now, the last law that I want to tell you about, and this is the last slide, and Nick alluded to it just now, and well done, because this just happened in Singapore. It's very new. Yesterday, there was a new law that was passed unanimously in our parliament. Unanimous is important because in Singapore, we have the governing party, we have opposition parties in parliament as well. Very unusual for a bill to be passed unanimously. But everyone saw that this was an important law. Now, what is this law about? It makes social media platforms liable for not protecting Singaporean users from online harms. We're talking about children, young people, and just adult Singaporeans. If we read something on social media, sometimes we can be affected by it. So, for example, there may be posts about suicide, or self-harm, or child sexual exploitation, or terrorism, or some people talking about racial or religious matters, posting information about public health. This is not about truth anymore. This is about people's opinions. When those opinions are talking about very sensitive subjects that the readers may read and then use the information to harm themselves, then this law allows the government to take down those posts, to say to the social media platform, take down these posts because they are not healthy for all of us. So with this law coming into place, it will take effect in 2023, and we will see what happens. Now, at the end of the day, when we look at the laws passed by Singapore, you can take Singapore as a laboratory experiment. Because we're so small, we can pass our laws very fast. And because sometimes we think we're caught between our Asian culture and Western influence, and we feel like a small boat in the middle of a big ocean. And we do our best to protect ourselves and to keep everybody inside this boat safe through our laws. So if our laws work, protecting people from online harm, falsehood, foreign interference, then I think they can be a good discussion point for how other countries and other societies can think about online harm and protection. But with that, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm looking forward to answering all your questions.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, fellow panelists. And now we move on to our fireside chat. Don't mean to interrupt your drinking, Adrian. Many of the 3 laws you mentioned tackle the digital space. I presume it also tackled the Metaverse or support the growth of the Metaverse, I should put it more positively. And how, are your local parliament how are you dealing with, as lawmakers, how are they dealing with the extraterritorial issues and human rights issues or challenges? Has that been discussed in courts, challenging courts, and how's that been dealt with? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. So let's talk about the Metaverse first. At the moment, the thinking in Singapore is that the Metaverse is an extension of the online world. So anything that's taking place in the Metaverse would be covered by the 3 laws that I mentioned. Eventually, I have no doubt we'll have a special Metaverse law, but only as the Metaverse becomes more developed. For the time being, I think having these 3 laws is sufficient to protect Singaporeans from these issues. And your second question is very interesting as well, and it mentions this phrase, human rights. So this is a concept I would say Singaporeans think about in relation to individual rights balanced against social responsibility. Now, in Singapore, we have a great value on social stability and harmony. This is because in our history, there has been racial conflict, there has been terrorism, and all kinds of bad things in the past. And although Singapore is stable and successful today, we look around the world and we see it is so easy for small countries and even big countries, like the United States, like Europe, like countries in Asia, to suddenly become unstable, to have citizens fight against each other. So Singaporeans ask themselves, we respect human rights, but we must also protect our social structure. And how do we use our laws to balance this? They do it through consultation. There will never be a perfect answer. There will always be people on the left and the right being very unhappy with the laws. But I should say, we're fortunate that most Singaporeans are largely satisfied with the balance that we have made.
But you've had a court case that discussed POFMA, right, with a challenge. How did that work out?
Oh, that's a very interesting court case. And the answer is that the courts had to rule on whether a statement is true or false. They also looked at the Singapore Constitution. What happened is there was a case where the government told a website to withdraw statements that were published that were not true. And the website was run by an opposition party. So it had a political atmosphere. But it also raised interesting arguments. Who is responsible for saying something is true or not true? Who is responsible for checking information? Can we give opinions? And so on. Now, I won't dare to explain the whole decision now. It went from the High Court to our highest court in Singapore. And the decisions are hundreds of pages. And if you ask me about cases, I can talk for 10 hours. But
don't bill me for 10 hours. That's all.
Too late. Too late.
Just joking.
Too late.
All right. Okay. So maybe we'll briefly go to Karen. Hi, Karen. Karen, your neighbors have passed 3 laws. I think Malaysia have been looking, in a similar space, and you very kindly put together a very comprehensive presentation just now of EU and other places. How do you see this progress as we're trying to grow the Metaverse? What safeguards should be put in place? And then I'll come to Ambassador about your personal take, having lived through the Arab Springs. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. What kind of safeguards? I think we need to take a holistic approach in terms of facing those challenges in how we want to manage Metaverse. So we cannot just be talking about implementing or enacting new laws. The new laws by itself only handles one portion of managing the Metaverse. I think we also have to be looking at the issue of whether or not we have proper structure in place. Like you mentioned just now, one of the interesting things is, even if we have laws within our domestic jurisdiction, how is that going to be translated in terms of cross-border implementation? And the structure that I would be looking at is very much within the model of what the anti-money laundering structure in the world, where they have the Financial Action Task Force, which sits all the representatives from the central bank, and they try to manage the money laundering laws across the world by trying to grade the countries, and then after that by trying to get the countries to buy into owning and being accountable to money laundering and counter-financing terrorism. So if we can do that, and if we can have that kind of a structure within our world, where all the countries come together and we sit together, pull our resources together, and then after that roll out a particular program or have a safety standard which is to be implemented across the world, and to have the countries to adopt those safety standards and enact certain laws in order to manage the Metaverse. I think that kind of holistic approach would be the most useful to deal with Metaverse.
Thank you, Karen. Ambassador, where do you see us going with the Metaverse to help reduce the digital divide and alleviate poverty? In your part of the world. Thank you.
But this just shows you that we do need 10 more hours, actually, and the complexity of this issue and the intervention of the great input of the panelists. We are living in a parallel world. We've always lived in a parallel world, almost, and how can we preserve our culture? If there's no post-colonial world, this post-World War II perhaps, but then again we have the same as Asia. We want to preserve our own identity, and we've gone through problems. We've had wars. We've had the same thing as if you mentioned the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a threat that has actually wiped 2 or 3 countries of existence. Right now we have 2 or 3 countries in that region who no longer exist the way they did for many years in history. So how do you protect your citizens? So that's the physical. Now the parallel technological part, then we've also introduced a few laws, and I've very quickly mentioned that 2 or 3 people had actually committed suicide because of problems on the internet. So catching up with all of this nationally, and then implementing this internationally, as I told you, 27 meetings, and we're still talking about the same thing. So this will take a very, very long time, and it's a very sensitive issue. And again, the set of morals is slightly different. Again, we're trying to take the European legislation or activities as a platform to how we should manage ours. That's going to be another area of contention. So perhaps, again, I'll go back so I don't go over the time, as should we have cities that have already in place, like Hong Kong. It's got a lot of tools, or Singapore. Actually, Asia is so much more developed in that sense than we are. So should we hold some format, and now that we're talking about the Belt and Road, with these expertise, and bring some government officials to learn, like I did today, to see how we're going to go forward and how we're going to get these 2 parallel worlds. There's no stopping progress or development. We need the youth to come in, the young people, to help us understand. That's my. Thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sandra, you mentioned the Metaverse is not just about an online platform. What do you mean by that? Especially in the area of data privacy, what would you advocate?
Well, what I mean by that, I think at the end of the day, it would be, when we look at it, it's because of data. So if we look at it from a broader picture, and especially Karen also mentioned about how can we build something which works globally. I think it would be important for us to look at a common kind of standard which can help us between organizations and also in different jurisdictions that work. Especially for data protection professional, we will be looking at not just single jurisdiction, but also different jurisdictions. So basic principle, how does it work in different jurisdictions, data framework that built on accountability principle, especially in jurisdiction where it's not yet the law, but it depends on a lot of the approach by the organization. And at the same time, when we look at data protection, it is not just about the rules, it's not just about guidance, it's about the people that practice it. So I believe that it would be important when we look at the digital policy and also the data policy, the governance around it, the profession and also the talent that we need to grow is very important and key. It's not just about the guidance that we would like to see, but about the quality of the people that practice it. So even though we have guidance here in Hong Kong that call out for the appointment of data protection officer, etc., I do think that it is really important and key that we need to look into it, whether we need to grow a profession here and to participate, not just data protection here in Hong Kong, but perhaps beyond Hong Kong and to the other parts of the world. I think that's something we need to think about as well, not just about the hardware, but also the software.
Fully agree. So self-education in my case, also proper laws and legislation, working with stakeholders, working with our friends from Singapore, from Malaysia, from around the world, especially our Belt and Road friends. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have for this panel discussion. Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So just now we have heard from our guest speakers, the moderator, Mr. Nick Chan, MXJP Director of Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, AALCO, Hong Kong Regional Arbitration Center. Physically, Mr. Amr ELHENAWY, Consul-General, Consulate-General of Egypt in Hong Kong SAR and Macao SAR. Ms. Sandra Liu, Global Head of Privacy, London Stock Exchange Group. Virtually, we have Ms. Karen Yilin Che, President of the Malaysian Bar, and Mr. Adrian Tan, President of the Law Society of Singapore. So I'm sure all the audience have benefited greatly. So now may I invite Mr. Chan to present a souvenir to the guest speakers as a token of appreciation and to take a group photo. So our President of the Law Society of Hong Kong, Mr. C.M. Chen, is joining the guest speakers for a group photo session. Ready, say cheese. Again. So we are now approaching the end of our morning session. As a council member of the Law Society of Hong Kong, it gives me great pleasure to be with you today to witness and to learn from all the speakers this morning.